Archives are about space and about time. There is always a hidden something that we have to look for very carefully.
A hidden concept, a hidden document, and a hidden narrative. How can we preserve an archive?
And how can we preserve documents in an archive? Archives are very important as a protest against forgetting.
If we want to anticipate the future, the lessons of history as a discipline are central to the art of archiving.
The future is sometimes invented with fragments from the past.
Well, I would like to, first of all, I would like to thank you very much, Andrew, on behalf of the Norman Foster Foundation for having accepted our invitation to participate in this Conversation and Archive series. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be here with you today. And of course, I think, the Getty Foundation, the Getty Research Institute should absolutely be in a conversation about archives, because I think, the Getty Research Institute was probably one of the first institutions that understood archives in what I would call an expanded way, okay? Because archive is much more complex than when we thought archives were in the past. And I think, of course, the Getty Foundation should be here, absolutely. And maybe to start with, you would like to tell us a bit, just shortly, what the Getty Research Institute is, the idea, the concept, etc., of the institution. I think that would help, our viewers.
Well, first of all, Estrella, I'm so delighted to be here, both with you and the Norman Foster Foundation, because we very much think of ourselves as a international or global research institute, and very much want to be in conversation with scholars and foundations in Europe and around the world, and not just in the United States. And that, of course, is one of the things that makes the Getty Research Institute, but also American research institutes, often different than their European counterparts, because in Spain, in the Netherlands, a research institute in art history would study, a Spanish one would study Spanish art, a Dutch one would study Dutch art. But in our case, we're really committed to supporting research in any area, in any period. And about almost 70% of the material in our library and archives is not in English. And so one of the big challenges for us, especially because languages are not very well taught in the United States, is finding staff that have the requisite language and other expertise to be able to work with material in probably 70 or 80 languages. So the Getty Research Institute has several main parts. We're the largest art history library in the world. We have about 1.6 million volumes. We also have an international residential scholar program. So we invite between 50 and 60 scholars to be in residence with us in Los Angeles every year. And then the two things that I think are most pertinent for this conversation is that we have tremendous archival collections that are particularly strong in the United States, Europe, Latin America, and increasingly in Asia. Our African collections are not very strong, but it's something that we are committed to working on. And those collections, we have probably about 10 million photographs. We have the papers of artists, architects, critics. We have gallery records. And then we have large collections of works on paper, prints, sketchbooks, an enormous collection of audio video material. We have probably about 12 or 13,000 tapes. And of course, we have made a big commitment to the digital. So we both produce products like the Getty vocabularies, the Getty Provenance Index, and most recently, the Getty Research Portal, where we're working with other libraries across the world to try to make all the art history books that are in the public domain available in full text to anyone around the world, and working with libraries in Europe, Latin America, and Asia. We've digitized about 150, 160,000 books, which are now all available.
Yeah, this is, this is why I said before it was like an expanded archive, because really you keep lots of objects, and I think this is the most intriguing and interesting thing about the archive at the Getty Research Institute. You keep lots of archives on the other hand, you keep objects that today probably are considered artworks. I mean, not only documents. And this is, this is the tricky and interesting thing about archives today, especially, the Getty Research Institute, because you have a remarkable collection of photographs, and some of them are artworks. I mean, they're arts are piece today, and this is very intriguing to me. I mean, very interesting. I don't know what you think about it, Andrew.
Yes, well, I think, and I know your own work is interested in this. One of the main areas that we collect is work that is on that fine line between being a work of art and an archive. Mm-hmm. So, particularly with more conceptual art, that line is always a difficult one, and one that we spend a great deal of time talking about with the artists whose archives. So for instance, when we acquired Klaus Oldenburg's archive, we acquired about 2,000 drawings and about 1,000 collages that he made. But these were not even, I think they're very much works of art, and some of them are quite great works of art, but he also thought of them as research, as process drawings and collages, which he felt were separate from the really finished drawings and collages that he made and circulated in galleries and museums. And we thought that we're always, I think that you need to work or look at each artist's career to really make those kinds of distinctions, which will be different for, there's some artists who don't exhibit or sell their drawings, and they consider it really part of a process that leads to a finished sculpture, land art, conceptual work. In those cases, we would, be very interested often in the full. In other cases where, the drawings, works on paper have been very much part of the exhibition history of the artist, it might be more appropriate for those works to go to a museum than to the Getty Research Institute.
No, yeah, and I think this is, this is probably the interesting thing about nowadays, how where to sort of draw the line, and how objects are perceived one way or another, depending on the approach, and depending on the approach of the artist. I think it's, this change between artworks, or this confusion between art pieces and archive material is probably made up by art historians more than artists, probably in the last decades, I would say. And sometimes works are exhibited when they should be, probably more like not like a secret material, but more intimate part of the process, as you pointed out very well. You were talking about something that I think is very important for the Getty Research Institute, and I think is very important for all archives today, and is the digitalization for preservation of special collections, and not only special collections, but I mean, to make, archives more accessible to a larger number of people, especially, in these days. And not only that, but I would like to ask you, are you not only this kind of digitalization, but are you keeping, internet material and things like that?
Yes, that's a really good question. I think that we're all learning. Well, first, we're learning that there's a much larger audience digitally than. So we welcome about 6,000 readers every year in person to come to Los Angeles and but we have over 1 million people who access our material online. So it's an enormous difference in magnitude. What we're learning is that all of archival digitization is not in and of itself good enough, that we face something of a crisis, I would say, in the whole archival field, because what we're realizing is that archival practice is really about making physical material accessible to people who want to. But when you are going to make things available in digital form, what we've realized is that our archives often don't have the necessary metadata to be able to be discovered or to be useful. So we face an enormous challenge, which is that do we catalog, do we add metadata to every object in an archive, which would normally take years and years to do? We're experimenting with all kinds of different things about computer vision and machine-generated metadata. But right now, I would say we haven't solved the issue yet, even though, as you were saying, digitization is both central to preservation issues as well as to accessibility issues.
Yeah, but I think it's really a challenge for archives, as you were pointing out before, because of course all the material that it's in, in Facebook and Instagram, etc. I mean, where to keep it, and how to preserve it? This is probably one of the biggest questions, that we are all very worried about, because I mean, if probably some years ago nobody would think preserving Warhol Polaroids was so important because it was like, like trash material, okay? But now, of course, Warhol Polaroids are kept like treasures because they're really a treasure. And, and I wonder, because of course, keeping all this material that it's in Instagram, I mean, lots of interesting stuff. Some of my students are now working on images published only in Instagram. And I think, this is pretty pretty much the same all over the world. And what to keep, what to preserve, and how to preserve it. This is one of the main questions that I think archives are facing today.
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult. I mean, we faced that when we acquired Frank Gehry's archive, and as you can imagine, that was a case where, as architecture offices went to digital, they used all kinds of different CAD programs.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the companies and many of the programs were incredibly short-lived, just like the internet. And so you can't read the company no longer exists, or the operating system. And so how to capture that, and as you've said, so much of what goes on today in our contemporary world is ephemerally or we have been seeing it as ephemeral and on the internet. Well, the Frank Gehry archive, to go back to that, has its digital storage is as large as everything that the Getty, not just the Research Institute, but every part of the Getty has created digitally since its existence. So that one archive doubled our digital overnight, and we expect other ones to. And so the challenge then becomes both, of course, the tremendous cost of both preserving and migrating these, because none of these digital platforms are stable, but also how to make things of that size accessible in a legible way. Because, staying with the Gehry for a minute, the archive came with 150,000 drawings, architectural drawings alone. You can't have an archival system which just says drawing number 1, drawing number 2. No one would ever find the drawing that they're looking for.
That's, the Frank Gehry story is really fascinating, because I think it's actually pointing down to something which is extremely interesting. It's like, development of media, and has changed a lot. And so it means that, as you said before, some companies, stop. I mean, you can read some material, 10 years ago, programs, even in your own computer, change a lot. And maybe you can't read something you wrote 20 years ago because there's no way to read it. And, this is one of the main challenges. And I think, the case of Frank Gehry is really interesting. The case you were pointing out, because it's a challenge. And as I said before, what to preserve and how to preserve it. And as far as the digitalization is concerned, do you have you have a special program or something for special collections, or are you, how do you take the the digitalization of a special issue or something? How does that work?
Well, we have a whole department that just handles special collection digitization. The Getty centralized much of its digital a number of years ago. So the same group digitizes museum objects and archival objects in the GRI special collections. And then, you know, we have another team that deposits those digital records into the preservation and access systems. And one of the things that we've learned is that the preservation system, or at least the one we have, doesn't work very well as an access system. So
in what sense? In what sense?
Well, our preservation system is great for making sure that material doesn't disappear. It tends to treat objects as very flat. So you get Betty Saar, and that, as we were talking about, is just not a satisfying. So our colleagues in the Getty Digital built something that they're calling the research collection viewer. So that takes the metadata that's in a finding aid, which is the standard way that archives are processed, and breaks that data apart and tries to attach it to individual images. So that if you're interested in only images of Klaus Oldenburg's lipstick sculpture, you will find that and not have to wade through. So, but it's a challenge. Right now, that system is only working really properly with our Ed Ruscha archive. So we acquired 750,000 photographs that Ed Ruscha took of Los Angeles. And he never printed them, or he only printed a very small number. So that was a case where, you know, this line between art and archive. But we had to take the unusual step of changing the material, that is making a digital positive from a analog negative, in order for anybody to be able to see. We got these this archive. There were so many photographs that Ruscha, even though they're still images, he wound them around motion picture reels. And obviously we couldn't hand somebody a motion picture reel and a magnifying glass in a reading room. So, you know, that's a case where we knew we needed to do a whole number of things that in some ways change the nature of the material, but in order to make it so, we not only digitized these photographs, but in order to figure out where to make them useful, we worked with a geospatial firm in order to give longitude and latitude points so that you know where the photographs are. And because he kept photographing the same streets and neighborhoods again and again, that was the only way you could compare one photograph of the same image to another. So those are the kinds of things that you face in digitizing an archive. And I think a lot of the next 20 years or so is going to be solving these issues so that the digital experience of navigating an archive is as positive as the physical experience, which
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I think it's two different experiences and complementary probably. You know, sometimes and I think, you're absolutely right. I think if you work, if you kind of get to know an archive digitally and then go to the place, you probably save a lot of time and trouble, because it's very true that sometimes, when you're using a new archive or a new Biblioteca Nacional or the British Library whatsoever, you have to understand the system. You have to understand the not only the system but probably the mental system, okay, because and I think, digital forms, well, it's a different form of knowledge and access to knowledge, probably, isn't it?
Yes, and it has some of the same inherent issues and biases that you talked about in the physical, except most of us coming in the humanities don't understand enough about the algorithms that, so one of the things we've been trying to do is meet with
Mm.
scientists and information theorists to discover what are these powerful algorithms that we're all using to make our material. What are the inherent biases within these, and what can we do? Because turning, um, when you don't want necessarily the big tech companies to be the ones that are determining how your archival material is organized and accessed.
No, absolutely right. You have to understand you have to understand their actual mental schedule and sort of redo it to work for something which is a different field. I fully agree with you. I mean, it can stay a mystery. So, how do you think scientists and science in general can help archives? Because I have the impression that archives are going they're sort of gaining momentum, and they're going through a very drastic, very important change altogether. We have to, and archives and probably users of archives, we have to sort of make a complete mental change to sort of approach this new digital era in archives. So how do you think science can help us?
Well, we've had some interesting conversations with some of these computer vision specialists. So they're interested in working with us because facial recognition, computer vision was developed to look and analyze mostly photographs of people.
Mm-hmm.
And it does that fairly well, even though that's a case where the inherent biases that we're talking about come in that the darker someone's skin, the less well the algorithm works. So it's not how they work. Where if a computer is looking at a drawing, it'll say, it thinks that there's a 70% chance or 70% probability that it's a Karachi. And do we want to embrace the sort of probabilistic universe of science, or stick with a more traditionally humanities-based approach?
Well, that's a great question, and I think it should probably this is probably the way our conversation should end, because you just made the crucial question, and I think not only refer as far as archives are concerned, but I think how science, how digitalization, how computers can help, and on the other hand, the kind of weird feeling we have, because we really have to change our traditional approach to issues. And I think this is probably the key question, and I think I can't think of a better way to finish our conversation, but with this absolutely great question you asked, Andrew. So if you want to add anything else, if not, we'll just leave this great question. And I want to thank you so very much for our conversation and letting us know more about the Getty Research Institute.
Sure. Well, I'll just finish by saying that, you know, as you're saying, that we've traditionally thought of something like attribution as a very conservative part of art history, becomes a potentially radical thing in the era of the digital. And it will be an interesting thing to watch over the next generation. But I just want to thank you enormously, Estrella, for really an exceedingly productive and enjoyable conversation. And also thank the Norman Foster Foundation, because I think it's so important to have this dialogue going around the world of art history, archives, because it will be the way that we access or do our scholarship. And these conversations are so essential that it go in a direction that we end up being pleased with down the line.